Alright guys, we're going to be doing an abbreviated lecture that gives you the basics of Atlantic revolutions. This is chapter 17 of your Strayer book and chapter 21 of the Bullitt textbook, as well as chapter 23 of Bullitt. Strayer combines them all into chapter 17. So we're going to be dealing with what are called the Atlantic revolutions. What that means is really revolutions that happened in places that sort of bordered the Atlantic Ocean. We're going to be talking about the American, and by American I mean former British colony, what becomes the United States. We're going to be talking about the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and also revolutions across Latin America. So they have a lot of things in common, and that's what I'm going to start with for you guys. In every single one of these areas, there was either an absolutist monarch or a colonial government headed by a monarch, and that identity was challenged by people who wanted greater democracy. And I put a giant double star there, and I'd like you to jot out to the side a little bit about that. So when we say, or when I say, I guess, people who wanted greater democracy, what we mean is not the kind of democracy that we are familiar with today in the 21st century. What we mean in that case is democracy by, for, and of white males, primarily. There are going to be exceptions to that. For example, Haiti is actually a rebellion by, for, and of slaves, or it turns into that. But in most of these places, when people were calling for greater democracy, what they meant was for dudes who usually owned property and were white to have a say in government. So I think it's really important actually to remember that property thing as well. So you want to have male, you want to have white, and you want to have property owner beside that word democracy, because at the time that's really what they're talking about. One of the things that helped to instigate or cause these revolutions was a growing middle class who were calling for changes in the government. And the result of these things is definitely huge change in social and political structures, especially in Haiti, where you see the overthrow of a plantocracy and the institution of the first black government really anywhere in the world, outside, of course, of the empires that we've already talked about in West Africa. But I want to give you the caveat that although there are huge changes, they're huge changes from a place of deep conservatism. So when you have an absolute monarchy, that's a very, very conservative political structure. And to have a dramatic change from that could be, toward a very limited democracy. So I don't want you to walk away from this chapter or this lecture thinking, wow, this is when true democracy, as we know it today, developed, because it most definitely was not the case. However, if you compare being a colonial government represented by an absolute monarch with really no participation rights recognized in law for your people, and you go to having limited representation and some participation, no absolute monarch, that is a very dramatic change. It just looks really conservative from where we are standing today in terms of having a full-fledged democracy with, almost everybody eligible to participate. Every single one of these revolutions was inspired by Enlightenment thinkers. If you kind of go backwards in time for this course, we talked about the Enlightenment in chapter 16 of the Bullitt textbook, and the Enlightenment thinkers, for example, John Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, all of those people who came up with ideas, for example, John Locke's 3 natural rights of life, liberty, and property, were extremely important and formed the ideology, the ideological background of these revolutions. And every single one of them created important documents, and they're actually listed by name in your time period 5 learning targets. The College Board has listed them as documents that you must know, and we'll examine each of these, hopefully, if Snow will cooperate with us in class. The Declaration of Independence, which we should be familiar with in the United States, although I've found in most cases that students are a little bit confused as to what text actually exists inside of that Declaration of Independence. So we'll hopefully get to take a closer look at it and see what it actually is declaring. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which is a document that comes out of revolutionary France, and the Jamaica Letter, which is a sort of holistic letter written by Simon Bolivar. He's sort of, for lack of a better comparison, the George Washington of Latin America. He is the primary leader of their liberation movement from Spain. Okay, we're going to talk about American independence first because it's addressed first both in the bullet and in the Strayer texts. The overall causes include especially the fact that what becomes the United States, aka the eastern seaboard of today's United States, so just the 13 original colonies, were British colonies. This means that they were directly owned by Britain. They were not controlled independently, and I want you to put a star beside the second bullet point, because I know a lot of times you hear about how the United States, for example, had problems with taxes. If you look at the facts, however, colonial Americans actually paid about 1/3 the amount of taxes that the typical British citizen paid who lived back in England. So a lot of the sort of traditional arguments about why Americans eventually voted for, or not voted, fought for independence sort of break down under analysis. It wasn't really, despite the movie The Patriot about freedom and equality for all people, that concept was extremely radical, or viewed to be extremely radical at the time of the American Revolution. Most people, unless they were pretty far out, would never say something like all men and women are equal in political rights and in intellect. It was actually the exact opposite. Most people at the time did not feel that people were all equal. And I realize that a lot of the sort of formative documents of the United States make claims, and over the course of our history, we have gradually enlarged the meaning of those words. So, for example, all men are created equal, right? We've extended that to women. We've extended that to all sorts of various races. And I think in a real, true sense, we mean the literal sense of those phrases much more now than we did when they were created. Mostly, and this is an opinion, but I think it's fairly well backed up in the actual historical record. Mostly Americans were very frustrated by being under the thumb of the British mercantilist economic policies. And if you guys go back in your brain quite a while ago, you might be able to remember what mercantilist means. There were a couple big concepts that we attached to mercantilism. The first was that the goal of mercantilism is for a nation state, the mother country, to collect and keep bullion, or like hard currency, gold and silver. And in so doing, colonies were viewed as sort of places that one could squeeze resources out of in order to enrich the mother country. And in many, many, many ways, the United States, the citizens of the British colonies in what became the United States, really disliked those policies and had a very deep resentment about them. For example, being unable to buy molasses from French producers to make rum. And I think that we read a little bit about that in our summer reading. The upper and middle class also wanted a voice in government, and when I said the upper middle class, I'm referring to the males of that class. They wanted more of a voice in government, and the Enlightenment backed that opinion up in a fairly logical and systematic way. And again, those Enlightenment ideas were extremely important to the American, French, Haitian, and Latin American revolutions. One of the reasons that we won is because we were helped by the French. France and Britain were sort of perennial enemies by this point in history, and they fought a number of wars with one another, going back a really long way. They'd fought wars in India, for example, before the American Revolution. And the French military without really the French military, our own military effort against Britain would have almost certainly been a failure. The French Navy primarily was a huge help to what becomes the United States in eventually being able to sort of fight the British off in a war of attrition. In the end, we were independent from Britain. Technically, the war sort of ends around 1781, but 1783 is sort of the official Treaty of Paris being signed. And we had a very limited democracy with strong checks on the people's power. I'm going to give you an example of that. Limited democracy means that not everyone is able to participate. So if you would, out to the left of that bullet where it says limited democracy, please note that that means not everyone could participate. In fact, the number of people that could actually vote was just tiny. You had to be a white, land-owning male. So you had to hold property, be a dude, and be white. So that was a very small portion of the population overall. When it says strong checks on the people's power, what we mean is, for example, a funny system that we still know of as being in place today, the Electoral College, which technically elects the president. Now, for almost all occasions, the Electoral College follows the will of the people. However, it does not have to, and that was written into the Constitution intentionally because the founders were extremely suspicious and cautious about giving the people too much power. And by the people, we mean sort of common, maybe not having very much education, not having very much land, etc. So the founders are almost universally upper class males who had very large incomes and usually came from very well-established families who had been in what became the United States for a long time. And they were very suspicious of people who did not share their class background. And the Electoral College that we still have in place today is a remnant of their desire to make sure that the people could not simply just choose whatever government they actually wanted. There would always be some sort of check on the people's power in place. Okay, French Revolution. This is hilarious. The French Revolution is huge. You can take whole classes in college just on the French Revolution, but I'm going to try to give you the overall view of it in one PowerPoint slide. So, overall causes, and Strayer in chapter 17 was very explicit about this, as was the bullet textbook in chapter 21. The overall cause of the French Revolution, the long-term cause is that the French government was bankrupt. In fact, there had been many wars stemming back to Louis XIV. I hope that you remember Louis XIV as the best example of an absolute monarch for his creation of Versailles, where all of his nobles stayed. Going way back to Louis XIV, there was a huge amount of money being spent in France, both on the upkeep of the absolute monarchy and the sort of co-opting of the nobility into that absolutist government, as well as on warfare. Huge numbers of wars being fought, both in continental Europe and around the globe as France began to construct its own sea-based trading post empire. And sort of the straw that broke the camel's back was the French helping the United States in its own war in the 1770s and into the 1780s against Britain. In addition, there was a class system in France, and the middle class of that system really wanted a say in government. The term Ancien Regime that's right there on the page is a little bit funny, so maybe put a little star or underline or put a little llama beside it. The Ancien Regime just refers to the absolute monarchy and the system of estates, which I'd actually like you to jot a little note out to the side about. Louis XVI was the king by the time you get to the French Revolution. If you would actually, up on the top, sorry about all these additions, up on the top of where it says French Revolution, will you please put 1789? That's the year that the French Revolution begins. Louis XVI was the king in 1789. He was a very weak king. He's sort of famous because he had as a hobby messing with locks. He really thought that locks were terribly interesting and liked to take them apart and see how they worked and put them back together. So he's a little bit of an interesting character and not really well suited to being king. He is at the head of this ancien regime, in which technically he is a divine right, aka instituted by God, monarch who's ruling over with absolute authority over 3 estates. So somewhere on your page, I'd like you to write the term 3 estates, E-S-T-A-T-E-S, and put a little underline under it. And I'd like you to write first estate. The first estate is the clergy, or priests, so people who work for the church. That's the first estate. And this was a legal entity in France. You belonged to this estate, and you had certain legal rights that went with it, including not having to pay taxes. The second estate was the nobility. Again, you had to be born into the nobility, and often second sons, people who don't inherit their father's estate, members of that portion of the nobility actually, in many cases, wound up as clergy, as members of the first estate. And finally, the third estate. The third estate was literally everyone else. So from the very poorest peasant who didn't own land and could barely feed themselves or their family, all the way up to exceedingly wealthy people who just happened to not be born into the nobility, so they didn't happen to be the Duke of Orleans. They just were born as a normal person, and they could be exceedingly wealthy. So the third estate is everybody else. And there were a lot of those people for obvious reasons. The top 2 estates made up about 3% of the population. So about 97 to 96% of the population was the third estate. There are, generally speaking, 2 main phases of the French Revolution, the moderate and the radical phase. The moderate phase is when the third estate began kind of a protest and began trying to institute changes, including having a constitutional monarchy. That lasted for several years. Louis XVI ruled as a constitutional monarch, very unhappily with the Estates General, which was, with the National Assembly, which was sort of like a brand new legislative body that got formed after those initial protests. However, France was invaded by foreign governments, and a mob mentality began to develop. And those outside countries invaded France because the absolute monarchs in countries like Austria, Prussia, and Russia really were extremely uncomfortable with the idea that a French monarch would be made into a constitutional monarch. They did not want to experience a similar downgrade in their own power, so they invaded in an attempt to stop that revolution. The radical phase of the French Revolution began after that mob mentality kind of developed. The leaders of the French Revolution began to see enemies everywhere, and they eventually cut off the king's head. They tried him for treason, which in fact he was guilty of. He was conspiring with the Austrian government to overthrow the new government and put himself back in a position of absolute power. And during that radical phase, the French will actually attempt to implement full-fledged democracy. So you went from, to us it wouldn't look very radical. It's where everybody gets to participate, although there were definitely some strange elements of it. For example, they altered the entire calendar for the whole year, but we'll get into that in class a little bit. But that moderate phase kind of looked like the early American government, and that radical phase looked like full-fledged democracy. And in the end, France, a very war-weary nation, was actually taken over by a general, a very successful general, who was fighting off the various powers who were invading France. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not actually short. That was sort of a dirty rumor spread by the British who fought against him. And he actually led France between 1799 and 1815 and crowned himself emperor. And really ran France as a sort of mild dictatorship. He was the sole ruler of France. And so they kind of wound up in the end of their revolution with a government that was almost identical to what they started with. But the French had been, remember the revolution started in 1789, so there'd been 10 years of complete chaos and invasions and wars. They were very tired of it. Napoleon Bonaparte offered stability, and so they went with it. After 1815, France actually invites the brother of Louis XVI to take the crown again, and he rules as Louis XVIII. So in the end, they actually get the monarch back anyway. It was a very strange process. In Haiti, we have a very different tale. Most Haitians were slaves, more than 90% of the population. It was a sugar-producing colony. And as the French Revolution was going on back home in France, Haiti, the sugar colony, actually began having its own revolution. And, France was busy with their foreign invasions, there was mob rule, and the slaves actually began a revolt led by Toussaint Louverture, and his name is right down there in that last bullet. They became independent from France in 1804, and unfortunately, and it's very easy to see how this happened, Toussaint Louverture began reigning in a dictatorial fashion, even after his capture and execution. He sort of set a precedent for corrupt dictatorial governments, and it's easy to see how that happened. 90% of Haiti's population were slaves, which means that about 90% of Haiti's population had an enforced policy of being unallowed to become educated. So you had about 90% illiteracy. And that's not a great scenario when one is trying to create a sort of Enlightenment-based government, where you've got informed participants from among the people in the government. So it ended up being a very bad situation, and we'll go into, again, a lot more of those details in class. In Latin America, you had a bunch of Spanish and Portuguese colonies. As we've talked about before, Brazil was Portuguese. Pretty much everything else was ruled by Spain. From really, at this point, it was what becomes the American Southwest down. They were also frustrated, just like the United States was, by mercantilist policies and the economic exploitation that came with those mercantilist policies. The middle and upper class was educated and wanted a voice in government. They were tired of sort of being ruled from afar. They thought they could do it better. We need to know two names. There are wars of liberation, and they are both led by Creole generals. And I'd like you to double underline that word Creole and put along beside Bolivar and San Martin. Remember, Creoles are Caucasian people, but they were born in the Americas. So they were not peninsularized. They were sort of one step down. And Bolivar and San Martin were both Creoles, and they both had a vision of what they wanted Latin America to look like. Strayer went into great detail about sort of the special makeup that Latin America had that made it very difficult for them. They had a very different social setting than for example, American colonies of Britain did. And this made it very difficult to sort of have a full-fledged revolution, because this Creole portion of the population was kind of afraid that the revolution might spiral out of their control. And they were definitely not in the majority. Remember, the majority of the population were various people from mixed race backgrounds, and the Creoles worried that that majority would steal the power away from them, and that they would actually end up in a position of inferiority. So they were really worried. Every time they tried to sort of have a reform, you can sort of see there's like a start-stop reaction that they have to the sort of Enlightenment ideals that are driving these revolutions, because they're constantly afraid that they're going to be overthrown. In the end, of course, they were independent, but no single nation was formed as in the United States. And they do attempt democracy, but in most cases, the Creole hold on to power at the expense of the poor, and they're unable to really sort of realize some of those ideals from the Enlightenment. So make sure that you have looked through Strayer carefully, not just to answer the questions, but to really understand what that reading was all about. And we'll be dealing with each of those revolutions in a lot more detail in the courses to come. Make sure that you've got questions. If you need them answered in class, of course, we're happy to do that.